Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you that if you do wish to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to get your opinions heard here on the show. I love getting your comments. You can do it in one of two ways, here on YouTube or going to our website, gsmcpodcast.net. Great way to really contribute to this show if you feel so inclined, but also just makes it that much better. Without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of the day here on today's show. Kind of sticking in the world of Thursday Night Football, talking about some player props because we have a lot of interesting players to talk about in that regard because of the fact we have so much multifaceted talents here in terms of running backs, in terms of skill positions, in terms of quarterbacks even. Because of the fact that it's also a divisional game, we're going to have to respect a lot more players, much more than we would for, say, a meaningless intra-conference game at the start of the season, because this is a highly important game for both of these teams. For the Lions, they want to prove their mettle in this division, prove they truly are the best, not just in the division, but in the entire NFC. And for the Packers, this one could keep them in the NFC North race, and that race for the number one seed, for that matter as well. Without further ado, let's jump right into who are going to decide this game. Throwing off the running backs here. Let's start off with Dave Montgomery, because I think now is his time to prove why he is still, quote-unquote, the lead back there in Detroit, even though it is kind of even in terms of touches and target share between him and Gibbs. I do think he's going to be an anytime touchdown score at minus 170, just because of the fact that Detroit's sustained drives always seem to end up in Dave Montgomery range. And what I mean by that is, when Detroit sustains drives, they're always physical and they always kind of stop at around the 5 to 1 yard line, and thus a guy like Dave Montgomery, who can be used a lot in goal-to-go situations, is going to have a lot of touches near the red zone in this one. And so that's why I feel like, even though Jahmyr Gibbs is responsible for a lot of what they do in the open field, Dave Montgomery is their finisher. He's their closer in those moments when they're there in short yardage situations in the red zone. And that's why I think that if the Lions start to control the time possession battle, especially later in the game, Dave Montgomery is going to have a bigger say in how many points they put up, because of the fact he is the guy that can really, really grind you out. And so that's why David Montgomery is someone who, even though not a lot of people might want to bet on this specific one, is a very interesting asset in terms of the betting market, because he's such a interesting player to analyze from that perspective. Let's talk about Josh Jacobs. Whereas I think David Montgomery is going to be the anytime touchdown scorer for the Lions, I think Josh Jacobs will score the first touchdown of this football game. It's a lofty kind of number here at plus 600, but I do think that if the Packers get the ball first, look for them to really give a lot of touches to Josh Jacobs in the first drive to really set the tone for what they want to do offensively in this one. And I know it's a pretty lofty number, it's a long shot bet, but I do think that if that's what happens and the Packers do receive the ball first, they're going to want to state their intent. They're not just going to be a little bit tentative and sit back and see what the Lions are giving them. No, they're going to say, we're going to try to grind you out, we're going to exploit your weaknesses, prove you're too thin at the linebacker and defensive line levels, and thus just run it down your throats. And Josh Jacobs is perfectly capable of doing that, especially early in games, because I feel like as this game's going to go on, this Lions secondary is going to prove to be a little bit more aggressive, and you don't necessarily want that later in the game if you might have to play catch-up. So look for them to instate their intents with Josh Jacobs, and I think that he very well could be finding the end zone on that first drive for the Packers. But that's the running backs for you. Let's go to the quarterbacks, because this is a very intriguing quarterback matchup, right? You have a guy in Jordan Love who seemingly is a little bit more diverse in nature than Goff, but we don't necessarily have a real grasp of of what he can be in the NFL, right? He had that one good season where he was second in the league in touchdown passes last year, upset the Cowboys there, but this season had an injury early on in that game in Brazil. Hasn't necessarily looked similar to what we saw of him last year in his first year as a starter. So I don't necessarily know how to view him from a betting perspective, but I think the safe thing would be to bet the under here in terms of passing yards. A, because I feel like this has become a more run-oriented attack, and B, I don't necessarily think you're going to have to pass to win this football game, even though you have all these weapons at your disposal at the wide receiver position. This feels like a game where you can ground them out. He's not going to have many pass attempts, I don't think, and I think he's going to be willing to allow Josh Jacobs to take over this game if he can. That's why I don't necessarily think Jordan Love will going to put up gaudy numbers tomorrow night. At minus 114, I think that's the safest bet for the quarterback position tomorrow night, just because that's going to be the Packers' MO tomorrow night. Run, run, run. There are going to be some opportunities potentially for Jordan Love in this game to prove that he can quarterback in certain situations and prove that his decision making maybe has improved in some regards. But overall, this feels like a Josh Jacobs game rather than a Jordan Love game. Even though I would love to see him try have a go at this in terms of really proving his stuff as one of the top quarterbacks in the league that could be able to take down Detroit come the postseason. So that's why I'm looking at Jordan Love to kind of be a little bit more serviceable and opportunistic in this one rather than trying to play hero ball. It's going to be an important thing to look at in that one as well. Then going over to Jared Goff, this guy has just been consistent, whether or not he's putting up gaudy numbers, whether or not he's just completing passes at a high rate and a high level. He's a very sneaky MVP candidate right now, probably not going to win it because he did have that 5-interception game against Houston, and he's not necessarily the sexiest option. He's not necessarily the Lamborghini. He's more so like a Lexus or something like that. He's not a shiny new object. But in this matchup against a divisional opponent, this is where I feel like Jared Goff can be in his element, you know? He's going to want to take the Packers down a peg, say, hey, we're the top dogs, and I think he's going to go over in terms of passing touchdowns, 1.5 at minus 120 here, just because, you know, even though Jared Goff is not necessarily the main reason why this offense is putting up points, he is kind of the driving force of what a game manager type quarterback can be at an elite level. When you know he has all these offensive minds surrounding him who can trust him to do certain things this offense. And even though, right, he's not the dual threat guy, he's not a Josh Allen, he's not a Swiss Army knife like Lamar Jackson, he is still a solid quarterback at the end of the day. So that's why I think that in this matchup, he's going to prove that even against these tough physical opponents, he can still grind out results for you as well. And then, in terms of receiving threats in this one, I do believe that there are going to be a lot of opportunities for different receivers to really sink their teeth into this game, but it's not necessarily going to come right away. I think that these two teams, like I said, are going to try to grind the other out and go from there, right? Because both of these guys at the quarterback position, Jordan Love and Jared Goff, we know they can spin it, but they don't necessarily want to risk it in terms of trying to test these two stellar secondaries. So look for them in terms of receivers to really be more effective as the game goes on rather than really early. But that being said, I do think Jameson Williams could be a huge X factor because he is the deep threat here for the Lions. And I think that, you know, testing a guy like Jair Alexander is tough because he's going to want you to keep you in front of him. But I feel like Jameson Williams is one of those talents where his top-end speed and pace provide enough electricity where the Lions could be confident in getting him in a one-on-one situation isolated with Jair Alexander. So that's why I think he could potentially hit the over in terms of yardage. 48.5 receiving yards, minus 115. It could take surprisingly long because, like I said, this is a very physical divisional rivalry. But I do think he could be a big aspect as to why Detroit could pull out this one late. just because of the fact that having a guy, a game changer at the position in terms of speed, really makes a difference for the Lions, because Jared Goff knows he has that in his back pocket if the ground game isn't necessarily going as expected. So that's why, I'm more confident in a high-end receiver from Detroit really having a say and impact in this one than one from Green Bay. And that's why when I was looking at Green Bay's receivers, no one really tempted me in terms of really standing out in this game, potentially as a nice little bet on. That's why I went to Tucker Kraft here, because like I said, Tucker Kraft yesterday when I was ranking tight ends is someone who is not necessarily revolutionary, but he can do everything well. He's a toolsy tight end. He can block for you. He can run up the seam for you, run nice routes, be physical in the red zone especially. And against this decimated linebacker core, look for him to sit in coverage and really try and exploit them as well. And I think that the main threat of Tucker Kraft is that most of his production can come in the red zone, but he is a very underrated open field tight end. He is very underrated in terms of yards after catch abilities, and I think that's where, if the Packers see mismatches they like, that's where Jordan Love is going to be looking to a lot. So look for Tucker Kraft to be an anytime touchdown scorer at plus 175 in this one, just because you're going to have to find certain matchups in the pass game you like to try and play catch up with this Detroit team, and Tucker Kraft is going to be a very reliable target. He's going to be a lot more physical than these third-string linebackers Detroit has, so look for him to have a huge advantage in this. But overall, going to be a very fun matchup. Like I said, it's going to come down to a lot of these running back guys when we're talking about Josh Jacobs, Tucker Kraft, David Montgomery, Laporta maybe, Goff, and his ability to stay in structure, and Jordan Love for his ability to just manage the game as needed. So I think this is going to be an interesting one. Let me know what you think in the comments, because coming up next, we transition to our final positional rankings for the week here with a defense and special teams units as you need to look out for this weekend in fantasy, because you definitely don't want to miss it right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search